Welcome to Transform Now, brought to you by SSNC, where we explore the future of work through the lens of AI. Across industries, leaders are rethinking strategy, culture, and operations to harness AI's full potential. This podcast gives you the insights and ideas to transform your organization, stay competitive, and thrive in a world driven by change. Let's get into the show.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. I'm your host, Michael Marchuk, and today we're chatting with Carl Lenocker. Carl is a customer success advisor, executive coach, and a best-selling author of the book A Success Plan for Life. Carl's work focuses on trust, adaptability, and decision-making under uncertainty. In recent discussions, he's explored how AI is reshaping, not replacing, the core human capabilities that drive effective leadership and customer relationships. Welcome, Carl.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for having me on the show, man. Huge fan.
I'm glad. I'm super glad to be talking with you because you bring a very unique insight into this whole idea of change, especially, but the idea of customer success. So we want to definitely explore that. But maybe you can give us a little bit more about yourself before we jump into it all the way.
Sure. Yeah. I am, for those who haven't heard of me yet, a 30-year technology veteran. And if you're not watching the show today, just know that I'm a grizzled 50-year-old, bald, typical straight out of central casting senior executive that, when I walk into a boardroom, customers lean back in their chair and they say, holy, that guy looks like, he has some credibility. I want to listen to him. I want to hear what he has to say. So, I've been exploiting that to my advantage for the last, decade plus on the post-sale side of the ball here in the enterprise software industry. And I've, recently released a best-selling book, Success Plan for Life. You mentioned it. That talks about how I used a lot of the principles that I've learned in this business to create a multi-million-dollar net worth for myself over the years after starting with absolutely nothing. And I'm happy to talk about all of it with you today and even more. So,
well, that's good because I wasn't planning on interviewing a Nepo baby. So good for you. It's self-made.
The only way.
That's right. So tell us a little bit more about the concept of the book and what led you to go write this in the first place.
Well, a big part of this was I've got 23-year-old twin girls that were both graduating college this summer, last summer, and they were going out into the world. And we kept having ththese conversations about what did I forget to tell you about, with career and building a life and how you can be successful and don't make the same mistakes that I made growing up. It just turned into, somebody telling me at one point, God, you've had so many conversations with them. You've sent so many text messages. Why don't you just write this down and create a book? And then I was sitting at a bar with one of my sales reps, out in Seattle, calling on a customer one night, telling him about the concept for this book that I had kind of loosely in my mind. It was going to be about customer success. I've been doing this for so long on the post-sale side of the business. I've got all this knowledge. What do I do? And he kind of nudged me to, why don't you take those ideas that you're writing down for your daughters and add them to this customer success methodology that I know you use to build your life on. And maybe you could put something out there that people could benefit from. And so that's kind of led me to where I'm at today, where I'm kind of fully dedicated to just sharing the wealth. I've reached a point in my life where I've done good. The business has been amazing to me, and I just want to give back. I want to help people out.
That's fantastic. So as we look at how AI is changing things, you noted it in a recent post that AI is accelerating decisions, but it doesn't own the consequences. Humans still do. So how should customer success leaders rethink accountability when AI is making recommendations, predictions, and even outreach decisions at scale?
So there's a couple different ways to look at this. If you go to a conference these days, everybody's talking about AI and all the things that it's going to do and take off your plate. And, what I tend to see is you've got a group of leaders who are looking over here saying, hey, this is really great because, we can trust AI with a lot of this high-level decision-making, and we can basically hire people cheaper who are less qualified, who maybe don't have advanced degrees and 20 plus years of experience in the business. And this has been like a dream that these same leaders have had for years. Let's face it. They've been trying to do this for 20 plus years. It's never worked. Every time that something new comes along, they rush to it. They hope that they can save money, but it never works. Now you've got folks over here on the other side, like myself, who say, wait a minute. All right. We've seen this puppet show before. I've been to this thing and I've seen the strings, right? And the way that this is really going to go is that, folks like myself who've been doing this for, forever, who have the knowledge are still going to need to be engaged. In fact, they're going to be needed more than ever going forward because they can look, very quickly at some of the stuff that's coming out of AI and determine whether or not it's true, whether or not it's relevant, whether or not it's going to apply in a particular situation with our customers. And so I think that, like you've heard before, right? AI is going to make us more efficient. It's not going to put guys like me out of business. It's going to help me. And unfortunately, on the low end side of the business, like where folks are coming out of college right now, trying to get experience in this world of enterprise software, a lot of those jobs are being squeezed. Folks are having trouble getting experience and coming up through the low levels like I did. And maybe there's not going to be as many of those folks. So again, we're going to reach this kind of catalyst period in maybe a decade or something where, a lot of the old guys like me are aging out and the experience is dropping off. And we've got to figure out, what are we doing for the future? How do we replace, guys like myself with folks who, actually been there and done that and can advise.
How can you advise companies who are looking to do this type of thing? Because as you mentioned, this is going to drop off. The experience is going to disappear with people who are just, natural attrition. The experience disappears. And since they're not hiring in these entry-level roles, we're losing some of that expertise. What kind of thoughts do you have in terms of how to maintain some of that expertise inside the organization to help grow that next level? If in fact we are cutting a lot of these entry-level roles?
I was very fortunate in my career to come up, and grow up, quote unquote, at Hewlett Packard in the early 2000s. And I consider that to be, really important to where I'm at today because, I actually, had been working at a computer store before I got into Hewlett Packard. I was selling computers, back in the day. And a buddy of mine that I used to sell computers with, I ran into him at a party one night. And he said, I'm on the help desk at HP and we've got some jobs. And, if you know anything about computers, you need to come work with me because they're paying insane money and you can get in and work at HP and get a permanent job there. And people never get fired. They get to stay there forever and they get to grow and, you make a ton of money and it's going to be great. And so, I think back to that party.
Boy, did he sell that.
Yeah, it was just, well, and my dad too at the time was like, oh my God, Hewlett Packard, that's a real company. Like if you get in there, you're set for life, you're set for life. And, flash forward to, March of 2000, I'd been on the job for 30 days and the dot-com bust hit, right? And all of a sudden, all the dreams and hopes that I had for this role kind of went right out of the window because I thought, oh my God, I'm gonna lose my job, and we had to go through, if folks are listening today who were not around during the dot-com bust, just know that it was very difficult. Anything that you're seeing today in the headlines in terms of layoffs and stuff, it was way worse back then. Okay. It was really bad. And, where am I going with this? I guess what I want to say is that while the dot-com bust inherently changed the way that companies like Hewlett Packard, took on and grew resources internally and trained people and kept them for life, right? That kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. There are companies out there that do a good job of growing talent internally, hiring interns, bringing young people up, through a career path where they get exposure to different parts of the business, encouraging them to take advanced degrees that are paid for. Those types of things were great for me. I spent 13 years at Hewlett Packard. I dodged 3 layoffs there before, one finally took and took me out. But, while I was there, just getting that education, getting great mentorship. One of the guys that I worked with there was employee number 6 at Apple. He used to tell me about sleeping on the floor of Steve Jobs' apartment in the early days when they had no furniture. Like stuff like that. I can't put a dollar amount on how important that was to my development. And if you guys are out there in senior leadership and thinking about this, in terms of what you can do for the future, I would say you've got to invest. It doesn't cost you a lot to invest in some of these entry-level positions and try to get people in, try to grow them, try to get your culture in them early. Because, loyalty like that, it's hard to come by these days.
Yeah, it is very difficult, but we're hearing a lot about this. AI is going to replace all the roles. I mean, we've heard this in news millions of times, and even with some of the news that's come out, even in the recent months, of how layoffs have been directly attributed to AI. Where I'm not really sure that's true, but it has been, and that's what the news has been, catching on. From your perspective, which customer success activities are genuinely becoming obsolete and which ones only appear to be replaceable because we misunderstand their real value?
So there's a few things that folks are kind of hanging their hat on in customer success these days that I think are going to go away with AI. First thing is, you got a lot of companies that are pushing CS folks to be more technical. We want you to go out and we want you to get all the certifications and train, and we want you to be able to write the code that our software runs on and kind of, do it all, right? And onboard customers like you're a solutions architect, things like that, right? I think, AI can do 90% of that work today. Like within 2 years, it's going to be able to do 100% in terms of walking your customers down the path of onboarding, education, answering their questions, troubleshooting their problems. Like that's not going to be a job much longer. So I hate to see that because a lot of these folks have done everything that their leaders have told them to do. They're like, "Oh my God, I did what they told me. I went out and I got the certifications. I studied hard." And unfortunately, those jobs aren't going to be around. And it's because, people are going to lose their jobs because they didn't have training in things like soft skills and things like relationship building and things like, program management and business. Like being a business person is going to be more important than ever. So, the technical stuff kind of go by the wayside. The next part of it, I think, is going to be the process stuff. I mean, we saw this a few years ago with, PMPs. Remember when project management professional was like the big hot cert? And anybody who got one of those could make 150 grand in this business. Like you could have been living in your mom's basement last month, but you went out and got a PMP and all of a sudden now you're making 150 grand. Um, process and project management can be done very easily by AI. Like AI can take all the crazy, unformed data and put it into a beautiful spreadsheet and give you due dates and give you, is it green? Is it yellow? Is it red? And I mean, I think that stuff is going to go away, So if you've been hanging your hat on that, I would say stop, and start looking at what you can get into that is more AI resistant. In my case, I've chosen to focus on strategic relationships at the highest level. And a lot of folks look to me, they use phrases like, he's a steakhouse whisperer, or he's an airport lounge legend, right? And it's because I'm known for getting on the road and getting in front of my customers one-on-one, belly to belly, and having real conversations about what their pain is and how we can address it going forward from a business perspective. I'm not trying to get in there and lay hands on anything technically. I've got a team of folks that I can bring in for that.
Yeah. So that part there, that human relationship piece, you talk about some of the interns and the entry level folks coming in. I mean, we've seen this generally speaking, and I know this is a very giant generalization, but Gen Z specifically tends to look at remote kind of connectivity, everything gets done through the phone, through the keypad, rather than necessarily face to face. So as these Gen Zers are entering into these roles and taking on these potentially face-to-face kind of activities, how does an organization break through some of that to help them understand why this face-to-face is so important?
Well, you hit on a really important thing there, which is, we got some generational issues going on just because of the technology that kids have been brought up, raised on today. And I think that was an important part of why I pushed both of my twin daughters when they graduated college to take SDR roles, as their first job out of college, I mean, also because the job market was really tough and there's not a lot of entry level out there right now, but a big part of being an SDR is learning to deal with, human to human, interaction and rejection. Like they're getting like punched in the face by rejection each and every day. And it's hardening them up. It's causing them to build a thick skin. They're learning, communication skills that will become very valuable later in life that a lot of kids don't have because all they're doing is texting. So I would say if you're an organization and you're looking at how can you help some of these young folks kind of break out of the cards that they were dealt in terms of their communication style and their preferences, this has got to be part of training going forward. This is stuff that we're neglecting right now when we're telling these kids, go out and learn how to code, go out and learn our product, and get certified on our product. But we're never telling them, here's how you call a customer and have a valuable conversation with the customer. Here's questions that you should ask your customer to open them up and get them chatty with you about what's going on. Like if you ever get into a dinner situation with a client, here's how to actually conduct a business dinner face to face, which most people these days have no idea how to do. It's like an acquired skill that they've learned. If you're doing it like I am, you learn how to do this somewhere along the way, watching really skilled people do it. But there's never been any class or training ever given you on these topics. And so if you want to,
So is your next book going to be Schmoozing 101?
Well, there's some great stories in this book about that, but I mean, I do a lot of like one-on-one training on these topics with people, and I've offered some consulting for companies in terms of how to, I mean, I'll go to dinner with your team. I'll teach you guys how to conduct a business dinner if you really want me to. But at the end of the day, like I find that a lot of folks who want to learn this stuff right now, they need to go out and do it for themselves because their company is not going. That's kind of the point I wanted to make, was that there's nothing, in it for them to provide these things for a lot of these
Yeah.
companies, because they think, well, that might be great long term, but right now we just need somebody who can install the product and like get it up and running, and that's all we care about.
Yeah. So that's something I want to touch on. So this whole idea that, our leaders currently have the experience for, as you mentioned, maybe decades of doing this, right? And even for these forward-looking, companies that are bringing in talent to be developed as leaders, this isn't something that's osmosis, right? You've talked about this in a bunch of different places, talking about emphasizing that judgment as a leadership capability, you just can't automate that kind of stuff. So in an AI-driven CS function, what does good judgment look like in practice, and how do organizations deliberately develop that rather than assuming osmosis will just happen?
Well, the first thing that you've got to be real about when you're talking about developing a CS function is that it's going to be different for every company and every product across the industry, right? And then, size of customer base. Where I'm at currently, carrying a $50 million book of business with, 3 clients that make that book up. The way that I approach CS is going to be a lot different than somebody who's got like a book of business that's less than $1 million, or some of these startups that I talk to where it's like less than $250,000 per CSM. It depends on what you're doing. So you got to be real about it first. So if you're at the low end of the ARR, I totally get it. There's got to be more of a focus on technical onboarding, enablement, troubleshooting, all those things. You're almost like a consultant at that point. And if you're at the high end of the ARR, like super strategic, like I am, the focus needs to be more on relationship building and ownership and being an executive who has executive presence, who can get in front of, senior leaders in a boardroom and speak. These are the different ends of the spectrum. And then there's everything in the middle. So I would say it's, you're designing a CS function. It's got to be bespoke right now to your company. It's got to be, bespoke to your product. And you've got to look at, AI as a helping tool. And, what can I realistically do with AI based on what these, what size organization am I in and what am I trying to do?
So you brought up an interesting point. I want to kind of pull on the thread a little bit. So you mentioned your book of business and other CS people who may have a smaller book of business. I mean, in every organization, you're going to have your whale clients that are, gold star. They spend a whole lot of money with you. And then you're going to have this long tail of maybe smaller clients that don't necessarily buy much from you, but you still want to have some kind of relationship, because you never know when one of these small clients, moves its way into the whale status. So with most CS, and I'm making broad brushstrokes here, you start outsourcing some of these contact points to AI because it's just easier. And the smaller customers, again, I can't have a dedicated CS person on a client that spends 10 grand with me a year, right? Or if we're a multi-millionaire company, maybe 10,000 for these startups is a big deal. But we started looking at that and you said, well, how can you transition that where you're continuing to build trust with these smaller customers when they have to know that their outreach is automated? How do you build trust with them in that kind of situation?
I think you nailed it, right? That the smaller customers are going to be where AI can do the most damage, right off the bat, in terms of, we're going to use chatbots out there in the industry. We're going to have documentation that's smart and maybe, can be adaptive depending on what the client's doing. Support that's automated so that when they're having problems, in the top 10 problems that come in, we've got solutions automatically given to the client so they can self-help, self-serve. There's going to be a lot of that stuff. But in terms of, building trust, it's got to work. I mean, that's the number one thing that I keep coming back to, is that if you're going to give this stuff to the clients, it's got to work. Because going back to the early 2000s, we went through a big transformation in tech support. I remembered it, we call it like the outsourcing crisis or something. If you lived through it, if you got laid off, In the early 2000s, you probably got laid off because your job was outsourced. And, one of the big problems with that was that, customers were very happy. Like, we didn't outsource tech support jobs in the early 2000s because customers were pissed off and they needed a better solution. It was all about money at the end of the day. It was all about, how cheap can we get this thing offshore? Somebody can do it for half the price. We can fire all these people and we can go about our business and we can say that we saved all this money. And most companies in the Fortune 500 did that. Most companies have pissed off customers today because of that decision. It's continuing. I mean, if you pick up the phone and call American Express right now or Chase Bank, the customer experience is not great like it used to be in the early 2000s. But you don't see a lot of empathy for that from the senior leadership of those companies. They've never really come back and said, well, we're sorry that we did this and we need to keep improving this solution. It's just kind of like, hey, this is what you get. Like, you call a bank, you expect to have a horrible experience on the phone. So I would say that we need to resist stepping on the same landmine with AI that we stepped on with the outsourcing of the early 2000s. We can't force customers into a bad customer experience and then just expect them to be okay with it. It's got to continue getting better. It's got to be, if you want your company to stand alone in a field of competitors, your solution has got to have a better customer experience and a better support experience than all the rest. And you can't just expect people to just take it because they have no other choice.
How can that experience, again, from a customer standpoint, obviously you mentioned it, when we call into a bank or an insurance company, the first thing we know is the bar is really, really low for customer experience, right? I expect to go through the whole, press 1 for this, press 2 for that, the phone tree hell, until you finally get to a point where you're tired enough to scream representative 50 times before you maybe get somebody. That bar is so low, and every time we as consumers have to experience that, we have that expectation. We just kind of sigh and move into it. Obviously, that's not engendering any trust. When we're talking business to business kind of relationships, obviously we're hoping that our relationships, or at least our experience, is a little better than that, because the last thing we want to do is have an RFP come out and perhaps replace our experience with someone else's experience and we lose them as a customer. How do you manage to transform the way CS sees customers, no matter what current value they have?
Well, that could be an all-night discussion at a steakhouse bar, because there's a lot to unpack there, right? I would say that you will never truly get away from treating customers, differently based on how much they spend, because that's just the reality of the business. I mean, if you got a customer that spends 10 million and you got a customer that spends 100,000, on some level, you are addressing the $10 million customer with maximum resources, and not because you want to, or, any other reason than the fact that if you lose that customer, that moves the stock. That'll move the stock of your company. And you got no choice. You got to put somebody on that account who knows what they're doing. But at some basic level, there's got to be some basic level of trust and support that cascades across all levels. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at in terms of, your documentation's got to be trustworthy. If you've got AI assistants built into your product, they've got to work, and everybody's got to be able to trust those. They've got to be efficient. Security is a huge concern these days. Every single time that you guys release product, whatever company you're at, you're potentially dumping security vulnerabilities out to the community. And now there's red team AI, things out there like Mythos that can go out and exploit instantly. And we're going to see that very soon, that software companies are going to be getting hit from all sides on security constantly. And that's going to be, probably more of an issue than it ever has been in the past, where like in the past, you would have big hacks that would go, on the nightly news, like, Equifax, and everybody would talk about it for a week or two. And then we'd all get like our free, year of like
Credit monitoring.
And we'd move on about our business. But like, if it actually starts to be a day-to-day issue and impacting you as a business and shutting down your ability to use some enterprise software you bought, putting your customers at risk, I mean, that's an area of focus that I think, folks need to pay more attention to now, because I think we're going to have a lot more of those issues in the near future because of AI, red teaming.
Yeah, that makes sense. So a lot of the CS teams in various organizations, they'll be taking on AI not only for the initial kind of customer success interactions, but also for some insights, right? So a lot of these platforms promise total visibility, health scores, sentiment analysis, churn prediction, blah, blah, blah. Um, where do you see organizations crossing the line from insights to over instrumentation? And is that going to hurt the customer relationship in the end?
Well, over instrumentation kind of makes me think a lot about metrics and, what metrics are you monitoring for your customers, your customer relationships, your product health, the customer experience. We've done a bad job historically throughout enterprise software of, doing things like telling our tech support engineers, get off the phone in 2 minutes or less, or resolve every ticket. We want you to resolve 95% of the tickets that come in, first point of contact. Like we put these kind of arbitrary metrics on people, and then we never really follow up or adapt to see if they're working or see how they're actually influencing the customer or the bottom line. And we end up with a lot of stuff being monitored and being measured that maybe doesn't at the end of the day really matter, or it doesn't matter as much as we thought it's going to matter. So I would say, with AI, instrumentation, all these things, I'm sure that there's going to be a heavy, bias on, trying to monitor, things like customer scorecard and customer sentiment with AI based on how many tickets they've opened up and how much they've deployed and how fast they're growing and all these things. And we just have to kind of take it with a grain of salt because we have to look back on our experience and think about, well, what happened last time we tried to kind of get a little happy with metrics and KPIs. It didn't go so well. We have to kind of bring ourselves back to center and remember what's really important to the business. And that's why I'm always telling young people that I come across, whether you're a support engineer or you're a CSM like me or a sales rep or whatever, be a business person first. Think about how my role impacts the bottom line at the company that I work at. And like, what's the reason I really have a job here? And then if you come back to that center all the time, then, things like KPIs that don't matter and bosses who don't know what they're talking about that are asking you for stupid stuff are not going to jar you. You're going to know exactly where you need to be, and you're going to be kind of able to hold that center line.
So the one thing that kind of got me thinking as you're talking through that was, we take the metrics and for all intents and purposes, as we look at the metrics that we have, our dashboard, we have all these green lights showing this customer is fine, right? They haven't opened in many tickets lately. The ones they have opened were closed within the 2 minutes, by the way. And they seem they all seem like they're fine, right? And then all of a sudden, they're not renewing. So one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is the dashboards and the KPIs will tell you the what, but the why behind it is what sounds like you're attaching these steakhouse meals with, right? You're having conversations about the whys behind it that don't necessarily come out in the what that they may be finding, right? Why haven't they opened any tickets? Maybe they're not using the software, or maybe they're not using the system the way we expected it to. Maybe they haven't moved forward because they lost their champion and they just really haven't talked more about it. And that's why things are changing that you just don't know. How can we build some of those human touch kind of actions back into the process when we've leaned on AI so heavily?
Yeah, it's tough. You made me think of a good metric. When you're talking about renewals and churn, I think it was on the Alex Raymond podcast, Account Management Secrets, recently. He had someone on who had done a lot of research on this, and he cited one that I thought was really interesting. He said that if you have a senior leader attend your last two QBRs, your chance for renewal with upside is 7x. But if the senior leader ghosts your last two QBRs, your chance for churn is 4x from that moment. And like that's actual data that is useful. You wouldn't really know about it, I guess, unless you had a person in the room who was kind of watching for those folks to show up and kind of judging sentiment and knowing really like if the guy's missing because he's got a sick family member, or if he's missing just because he doesn't find it useful. He doesn't find any value in showing up. You got to kind of take a temperature in that regard. But, I would say that, for to some degree, I'm thankful because I don't think that you ever fully automate or AI away folks like me that operate at the strategic level who have to sit down with leaders over steak, preferably, and bourbon and suss out what's actually going on, in building relationships long term. And you're dealing with, tens of millions of dollars. Like they're always going to want to see a human being there when you're talking about that kind of money. I think that's just going to be, a forever thing. And I'm grateful for it. That's why I'm always trying to coach people to kind of follow the path up and over to get into strategics as fast as you can if you want a long career in this business, because I think that's where the livelihood is going to be. But going back to your question about how do you put some of those soft skills back into a future where AI is kind of running a lot of these relationships or trying to do more. Maybe people have like 100 accounts in the future, because AI taking so much
Right.
away from their kind of day-to-day, boring, busy work, that they can just focus on, hey, let me make a one-on-one phone call to, my 100 stakeholders every week and have a discussion that I couldn't have before. Or where I actually see it make an impact is these smaller firms again that, we talk about scaled CS a lot in this business, and the smaller firms with these little $50,000 accounts where the guys are running like 500 accounts today, they have to ignore like 20% of their book of business because they're fighting fires all the time. And AI is going to take away a lot of the fires. It's going to take away a lot of the paperwork, and they're going to get into, one-on-one phone calls, texting, email with their customers, meetings, and things like that maybe they couldn't do before.
Do you see, like, let's take that example because I think it's an important one, because I see, especially in some of the larger organizations, that's not necessarily an outlier where the CS function has been leaned down to where a lot of the smaller accounts do get lumped into large baskets, right? Where the communications may not necessarily be as frequent. Where do you see AI? If you mentioned it's probably going to be a help. Where do you see it helping most in those baskets where you have 500 accounts that you're responsible for?
Yeah. Well, it's really going to kind of, again, enable you to do more that you probably couldn't do in the past. I think that, when I think about, how AI is going to amplify somebody's impact who has 500 accounts, I think about what their life looks like today. And it's a pretty life, to be honest, right? Because I'm thinking about 500 QBRs that need to be done every quarter. I'm thinking about 500 success plans that's got to be maintained. I'm thinking about, there's probably 150 to 200 accounts that are at risk in there. So that's, 200 risk reports that they've got to write and update every week or every month, depending on kind of what your cadence is. AI can take away all that stuff. I mean, it can take all that stuff away, and you can focus on, how do I grow these accounts? How do I ensure that these customers are content with our software? How do I get them plugged into like product and have actual productive meetings where they're, feeling like they have a voice with our people on where the product's going? How do I get roadmap in front of them? How do I do more training and workshops? Things like that. So I just think, we think about AI replacing people, and it's going to replace, a lot of this work. And if you specialize in any one of these areas, you could be replaced. But if you're kind of a jack of all trades, and you're doing, 100 different jobs right now, maybe it displaces 70% of the work so that you could focus on the 30 that's important. I think that's a message like everybody's been in agreement with. It's almost scary. Do you ever think about how when everybody agrees on something, there's a good chance that they're wrong? And this is one of those things that it feels like everybody that I talk to right now agrees on. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I feel the same way. The challenge I'm having is seeing the scaling piece and the disconnection from like I said, the personal relationship. And maybe it's showing my age here, the old school nature of personal relationships being the differentiator or the key to that success for the overall corporate relationship. When we have perhaps a generational difference, and this is happening not just in our organization, but every organization. So perhaps, and maybe this is a question to ask, is CS going to change because the same new CS leaders that were coming in now that are Gen Z are going to be connecting with Gen Zers at our customers?
That's one reason why it's got to change. I could list a few reasons why it's going to change, I think, in the future as well. You've got a lot of companies, especially in software, that are maturing out, right? And the customers are getting bigger and bigger, but they're growing at a smaller percentage year after year. And so there's not as much incremental revenue to be gotten out there by the hunters anymore. You used to just idolize the sales organization. A lot of these companies, you were like, oh my God, these guys are so incredible. And some of them still do. Like I work with guys who make over $1 million a year sometimes, depending on the commission and what deals they've got coming in. But that's becoming rarer and rarer these days, and I find that, you know, we really need to shift focus on post-sale account management in terms of customer success, owning the relationships and the management of some of these large accounts of these big software firms so that you can let sales have a little bit more breadth to go over here and hunt, find if you're inside of a company like, a Fortune 1 or Fortune 2 company, there's like 3,000 groups in there that you can sell to. And maybe you're selling to like two today, right? And there's a lot of opportunity, but the sales rep doesn't have, as much time on his hands to go do that if he's so invested in like account management activities. And that's where I see the future of customer success kind of taking over is give me this stuff. I'll go meet with these customers that we've sold to and I'll make sure that they're doing well. And, I'll talk over steak about the future and you go over here and find new revenue. That's like all you need to do. And just trust me that I've got this. I've got this under control and these guys are going to be okay. That's something that is happening at a lot of big firms, but not enough today. And I think it's got to be forced. And one of the reasons it's not being pushed right now further is because you don't have any former CSMs on boards at any major software companies. You've got a shit ton of sales guys in there, right? Chief revenue officers, all these people who've done sales their whole career, but no CSMs, like zero. Can't name a single one. And that needs to change.
Yeah, I agree. That you're losing that perspective for sure. So if you were sitting with the VP of a customer success today at any organization, and they're overwhelmed by AI and the pressure to transform, what's the one question they should be asking their teams to ensure that they're future ready, not just tool enabled?
Interesting. One question that you could ask your team would be, visualize your role in 5 years, right? In terms of, where you think AI is going to take us, what you think the development will kind of, put together a success plan for the future of your team, just like we would put together a success plan for our customers, right? If we're not writing down our goals, if we're not kind of, writing down the tasks and assigning dates and due dates and deadlines, it's not really a real plan for the future. And I find that, teams don't do that enough in the industry. People don't do that enough in their personal lives. It's funny how many people I talk to that, they say, oh, I'd love to be a millionaire one day, or I'd love to take a month, Greek vacation across the islands or whatever. And it's like, okay, cool. Like, when are you going to do that? Like, what's your plan? What's your plan to address it? And they don't, it's just kind of a someday scenario, which, someday is not anywhere on the calendar. Like you've got to actually, put down some hard stuff here and have hard conversations in order to create the plan. So, again, back to the principles of the book, right? Success plan for life. Everything in my life that's been good and successful has come from having a plan. And maybe I lean into that, a little bit more than others because I'm a CSM, but I see it play out day in and day out with my customers, with my friends, with my colleagues, my, buddy who feels like his career is stuck and going nowhere. Like, where's your plan?
So kind of transitioning to talk a little bit more about the book, building a success plan for a customer involves understanding a lot about that customer. And as much as we'd like to think we understand a lot about our own lives, we're kind of close to it. Sometimes we have some blind spots. So how do you build a success plan when maybe you're a little blind to the things you got going on?
That's a great segue into, there's a chapter in the book that I talk about discovery and how, the first time that I ever meet with a customer, I usually take them out for a nice dinner and, we pour some.
It's at a steakhouse. I know. I guarantee it's at a
100%.
steakhouse.
It's generally, unless they're a vegetarian. I have one client who eats steak. And so we do a little Asian fusion tour and we do sushi and things, but for the most part, it's steak. But anyway, we do discovery. And, a big part of discovery is knowing what the right questions are to ask and kind of, opening the wound and just letting it bleed a little bit, right? While you kind of absorb what's happening, what's in front of you. And I think when you're building a plan for yourself, it needs to be a similar process. I mean, I talk in the book about how, you should go by yourself somewhere quiet and, pour a drink or, have a snack or whatever and just sit and think with your thoughts. And, a big part of that is going back to your origin story. I mean, thinking back to the very beginning, not so that you can get stuck back there with whatever's happened to you in the past, but so that you can learn to live with it and learn how that will be a part of you going forward, no matter what. In my own origin story, I grew up very poor. My mother had bipolar disorder and was an alcoholic. Things were very difficult in my house, and I carry a lot of that with me into every boardroom, every customer meeting that I go into today because, I've learned through therapy and, I'm married to a psychologist now that children of alcoholics, we are natural people pleasers and we want everybody in the room to just be okay. Like we just, that's our role in life is to kind of calm things down and make sure that everybody's okay. And I think that influenced the way that I managed accounts and customer relationships for a long time. I was bend over backwards, let me take all the abuse that you'll put on me and I won't say anything and I'll just go with it and I'll make sure that you're okay. And I had to do some really hard soul searching internally to understand that, hey, you're not really doing your customers any favors here by not setting healthy boundaries. And you're actually, you're allowing abusive cycles to continue throughout your life that should have ended, when you became an adult and got out of that abusive situation at home. And so, I had to really look at that and decide to go a different direction. And I think everybody out there is dealing with something different, but you have to look at it and really kind of analyze it. And for me, that meant therapy.
So building that plan, if perhaps you are still wrestling with that's something you need to get past, but building that success plan for your life, it sounds like this is a longer term kind of endeavor. Do you have a short term, a medium term, long term kind of approach to this?
I do. I mean, like most of the self-help books that are out there, I talk about a, 30, 60, 90, or, 1 month, 6 month, 12-month plan, depending on what's right for you. But it really just comes down to, knowing kind of what you want to do and, what you're willing to do to get there. I use the example at the end of my book. I talked about how, I was going to be turning 50 years old this year in March. I did it. And I was going to be on a luxury yacht in Cabo with all my family and friends celebrating, in front of the Arch of San Lucas. And we were going to have this amazing party. And we did that. And that was the culmination of my plan. I went up to 50 years on my plan. I wrote it, years ago, and I've been kind of adapting it ever since. But while I was standing on that yacht, kind of having this party and realizing the success of the moment, I was thinking a lot about what comes next. Like, how do you top this, Carl? What are you going to do after this? And I struggle with stuff like that. I'm still working that out since March, kind of deciding what comes next beyond helping people, getting the message of the book out and, doing more coaching and speaking and things like that. I think about, what do I want to do, by 60, it's going to be different, better, more rewarding than what I've already done. And you guys have to, who are listening out there, who are building your own plans. I mean, think about it in terms like that. If you're 30 years old today, where do you want to be when you're 50? Like, where do you want to be when you're 40? Maybe by the end of your, 30th year, you want to be in shape. That's great. And then maybe by 40, you want to be a millionaire. And by 50, you want to be standing on a yacht, in front of the Arch of San Lucas. I don't know.
Those are interesting goals, but you're right. Those are the things that you have to, making them tangible gives you some kind of target to shoot for. So when you start looking at the broad thing, like I said, a success plan for life, because it's a broad statement to have, unlike our customer relationships, which, we can maybe, put those into a decade. If you're at the same company for that long with the same customer for a decade, I don't think that's super common, but especially these days. How do you do that? How do you apply that when you're hitting multiple phases of your life? You just mentioned one. Hey, I've hit 50. Now I'm looking at this next phase of 60. Do those phases have anything to do with how you interpret that plan?
You're talking about specifically to customer accounts now, right?
Well, I'm talking about a little both. I mean, we talk about customer accounts and then applying it back to your own
Yeah.
life.
Okay. I would say, customers, the longest customer I've been allowed to work on in my career is probably about 4 years. And, over the course of 4 years, you go through a lot of change. Usually at the beginning, you've got some sort of massive onboarding event. And maybe there was a migration to the cloud at some point because somebody said cloud is the future. And then there was a period of steady state. Maybe then there was like some AI initiatives that came, right? And you've got to kind of, roll with the punches in terms of onboarding and migrations are typically going to be a lot of hell. I would, probably equate those to being younger, being like a young single dad that I was, and going through a relationship breakup, and being kind of like a lonely and aimless, and just having to struggle with life, and then your accounts eventually kind of plateau out. They become mature. The adoption is there. If your customer's happy, it's all about kind of maintaining focus and kind of continuing to drive along the path. And that's where I would equate, maybe where I was in my, in my 30s or so. You're just like, get that money in the 401k, get that stock. Every year we're having the focal reviews with our bosses, get more stock. How can I get more ESPP at a discount? Like, what other endeavors can I get invested in, whether it was real estate for me, or at one point I was selling stuff out of my garage to get ahead, anything I could do to kind of fill those accounts up and get the money working for me and get assets that were throwing off revenue. And then you never know what's going to come up next. At work right now, it's AI with a lot of people. They're, getting their customers to adopt, AI assistants and MCP and all these cool things. In my life, I think that, there's a big focus on, maybe it's not about success and money anymore at this age. Maybe it's about wellness, and it's about, a future where, well-being and just being, thankful and grateful for where I'm at is kind of where the focus needs to be. And that's really hard to adjust when you've spent 30 years focused on just growing and getting ahead and doing everything you could to scrap out of a tough, poverty situation that I came from. It's really hard to change the course and be like, all right, now I need to be thankful. I need to be, someone who accepts that, I've kind of, won at the game of life a little bit, and I just need to be grateful and allow myself trips and, some things that I've earned, and more time with my wife at home, and to get to go visit my children, at their, they both flew the coop and they live on both coasts now, which creates a logistical nightmare for us. But, that's kind of where my head's at. I think, that's probably going to be 50s and 60s for me.
It's interesting. If you translate that back to the customers and our roles, customers are going to go through changes too, because there's economic cycles, there's internal leadership changes that cause their own changes within the organization itself. There's changes in our organizations, which then cause ripples throughout. So it seems like the success part of customer success is the relationship, because that's the only thing that really stays the same, is maintaining that relationship throughout that time, because we have to realize that there's change happening on both sides all the time.
Absolutely. I mean, we're all going through change. We're all going through different cycles, different parts of our lives, different parts of the relationship. We need to be, conscious of that. And, empathy is talked about a lot in our business, that everybody should have empathy. But do you really understand? Do you really feel it? Do you really, have value for the fact that person sitting in front of you at the steakhouse they got a lot going on in their life too. You may have like this much of the view, and there's this much going on. And so.
Yeah. Well, Carl, thank you so much for your insights. We definitely know who to call if we want to go get steakhouse recommendations in probably any city in the world. So I appreciate you being on the show and talking through this. And I'll make sure that I leave a link for your book in the show notes so folks can find it.
Well, you can invite me to steak anytime, Michael. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks for listening to Transform Now, the podcast from SS&C. You can find all of our episodes on your favorite podcast channel, as well as YouTube. To stay on top of the hottest topics in the world of agentic automation, subscribe now. The future of work is here.